Welcome back to Inside the Pastor Study Podcast. My name is Pastor Jeremy.
And I'm Pastor George.
And we are coming back to you. Excited to tackle this kind of the ultimate answer to this question that we've been working through now with background content for several episodes. This big question of why can't all Christians get along? Why is it that there is so much division and separation within the church? And so we've taken you on a very long journey, starting back at the beginning of the American experiment. And we've defined a lot of movements and changes within, especially the American church, so that hopefully as you've listened to this, you've gotten an idea of what makes certain denominations different from others. The hope then being able to clearly lay out some hopes for the future on what the church can do together, but also some cautions on maybe why churches shouldn't. So that's been the background, so that today we can get to maybe answering some of these questions. How do churches get along, and what does that hopefully look like?
Right.
Yeah. So one of the first things to hit, though, you've noticed this as you've listened to this podcast. We've spent probably 80% of the episodes on this topic talking about good reasons for churches to be divided.
Yeah.
Like there are significant theological differences that have been raised over especially the last 300 to 400 years of the Protestant church. And some of those divisions were made because of denominations or movements wandering far away from faithfulness to Scripture. And in that change, there have been organizations and churches and leaders who have said, no, we're going to remain faithful to Scripture. We're going to make sure that everything that we do as a church is based solely on these fundamental principles that we understand from the Word, and that's going to guide who we are as a church and what we do as a group. And over against other denominations that have kind of moved away from that. We talked a bit about that word love and how a lot of churches have used the word love as their anchor, but allowed the definition for the word for love to wander. And we talked, again about how those fundamental things, those core beliefs, are things that should really distinguish the church from everything else around. So if you remember way back to the beginning of this conversation, we had that bullseye illustration. So you had those core beliefs that, if you can't agree on the core things, that Jesus is the Son of God who was fully human and fully divine, and that he came from a Virgin Mary, and he was and he existed in real space and time, performed real miracles, died on the cross, really raised again from the dead, really reigns in heaven, really is coming back, and has really blessed us with Scripture that we can really rely on. Like, that's core stuff. And if we disagree in any of those things, then you might not actually be Christian. You might just have like Christian leanings or Christian history informing whatever you're currently believing.
Right. And you could even have the same denominational tag.
Yeah.
Right. And not have those core values, which is significant because it means that you just can't, it's summertime, people are going on vacation. You can't just drive into town and say, oh, look, here's the church with the denominational tag that we agree to. Maybe we should go here. But what's that rainbow flag all about, kind of a thing? And it just raises all kinds of questions, right, as to why can't I get along even with my other denominations? And it's because we have this constant winnowing in culture and in history where churches have just said, are we agreeing with these standards or not? And those standards go by the boards.
Yeah. We see that a lot in New England, particularly in New England community churches. I'm a cyclist. I'm out riding a lot through the region, and it raises my eyebrows when I go past a community church or Unitarian church, and everything in the exterior of that church is a talking point for a particular political party, and there is no mention of Jesus. There's no mention of God. It's all like billboards and flags and statements on whatever the current the movement du jour is. And I ride past things like that and just shake my head, because that is a body of people who probably have good intentions, who have let the definition for a particular word draw them away from the faithfulness to Scripture. And I would not put those people, as kind as many of them are, and as good intentioned as many of them are, I would not put them within the circle of orthodoxy. They're outside that central circle of faithful to who Jesus is.
So let's just put that in a warning really quickly, even to those churches who, by their very mentality, are the opposite of that, who are very conservative politically, and they want their church, they're so identified with that their church becomes identified with a political stripe. Folks, do not be like these dead churches where you are more known for your politics than you are for Jesus.
Yeah, on either side of the aisle, it's wrong and needs to be repented of.
Yeah, absolutely.
I enjoy following politics, but that's a side hobby to who Jesus is. And Jesus is the core driver of everything that we should be processing in life and how we view the world around us. It's not our politics. It's not our political view.
Right.
So be aware of those things on either side of that. If your church talks more about Donald Trump than it talks about Jesus, that's a problem. You need to find another church. If it talks more about Donald Trump because you on the other side of that aisle, right? So many people in America are unified in how much they talk about Trump.
Donald Trump.
They just talk about him with different adjectives. So be aware of all of that. That's not for the church. That's not the church's role, is to not spend more time talking about their politics than their Jesus. So that's a problem. So you have that core value piece. And then that second part, the conviction ring, which we've talked about. And sometimes there are things that we hold as convictions that are different than other churches in our community, but don't prevent us necessarily from good fellowship, good occasional fellowship. We had we do a National Day of Prayer thing here in our area. And we connect with a church on that National Day of Prayer and pray with the members of that church who are in a different conviction ring than us. And we would struggle in regular fellowship on Sundays, but on a special event basis, why not? We were praying to the same Lord, and we have the same core values, and we have some different convictions, but that doesn't prevent us from gathering in this place where we are unified.
Right. That conviction reading is it's almost a gradient, right? Mm-hmm. To use a word that's really popular in Windows terminology, there's a gradient of color that goes into that conviction ring. I mean, there are, for example, Bible-based convictions that are really close to those principles, that centering principle, mm-hmm. and those convictions are, I mean, those are like right on the line of those.
Right.
Hugely
important, but you're not out of orthodoxy if you disagree, but
exactly.
You really should have some commonality on them.
If we get further out in conviction, and again, here's another thing, right? There's a political conviction. Mm-hmm. There's a conviction, for example, that let's use one that's very, very obvious and very strong, and that is that we believe that abortion is murder, that there's a right to life. That is a conviction. It's based on a biblical principle, but it has a political, cultural, world application. Well, here's the thing, right? We share that biblical foundation, that core conviction, and that is a conviction. That's in our conviction ring as a church. We share in that conviction ring. We overlap with Roman Catholicism mm-hmm. on that. So would it be right for believers, for example, with a strong conviction for being pro-life, to rally and support pro-life people? Yeah, sure.
Right.
Sure.
And on the flip side of that, in the conviction ring, you have people who politically are on the other side of the aisle on this. They're more on the choice side of that conversation. And I really struggle with anybody who would be pro-choice, and because I see that as a life. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you're pro-choice, but that you're out of the fold and that you can't be a Christian.
That's right. Right.
And so like again, that's one of those pieces that can be really contentious here in our current culture, but it shouldn't, we should not be chucking rocks at each other. This is one of those places for deep, meaningful conversation.
Right. Right. I think conviction goes with like a comfort level, right? I mean, if you're pro-choice and you're going to a church that's pro-life, you have to make a decision as to whether you're comfortable with that.
Yeah.
I mean, if the core values are there and you agree on those core values, I would recommend you hang in there.
Yeah, and even if you agree on most of the other convictions, right? So it's just this one conviction that there is separation, even though it is a deep-seated one and can be very divisive. If everything else aligns, then it's worth hanging in and blessing your community with your perspective as you are blessed by your community's perspective. Yeah. So those are some key things here. So just circling back, like there are places where it is right to be divided as churches, where churches are just in that mode of heresy, and you need to keep those churches far, far away from your fellowship. It's better to be fellowshipping with complete non-believers than it is to be fellowshipping with heretical churches. It's just, I would be far, far from that. But there are areas, which we've covered in the last 2 episodes, where, man, we've just made some dumb mistakes as churches because we've gotten all hung up in the final ring of preference. And we've gotten into fights over preference, and we've ended up in different congregations in the same towns often, or in the same region. And so, but now those are well-established churches that have been around maybe 100 years. And so then, that's today. Like, how do we find some reconciliation, and how do we connect with these brothers and sisters with whom we agree with on almost everything? Right. We just started off wrong, and now we need to repair relationships. So I think in order to get to that answer, though, and like some of our solutions for that, it helps understand church dynamic a little bit.
Yeah. There was a church growth guy. I guess you would call him a church growth. I think he was more of a church observer. His name was Lyle Shaler, and Dr. Shaler, you could say that he was part of the church growth movement. I think he was just really a member of the church perspective movement.
Sure, church health, things like that.
Yeah. He was more of the kind of guy that looked at churches and said, here's how churches normally operate, kind of a thing. And then he identified some characteristics of churches and said, here's how the local church operates. He then moved on to how do you change that operation, and that's pretty difficult. If you're a pastor out there, I'd recommend you read some of his information because it's just really, really good. But some years ago, Dr. Shaler made a graph of churches by size, and he identified that churches have dynamics. They have character in them. And that character comes basically with the size of the church. And one of the things that he says is you can grow a church, but if you never grow the church out of its character, you will never sustain that kind of growth. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of guys were interested in growing churches. And so his graph, his ideas are very important in that. It's important to keep in mind in the United States that 80% of churches are under 100 people in attendance. That's not members. That's people in attendance on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, it's a staggering statistic still that's the case, but it's very accurate. Most churches smaller, very small.
Yeah. And especially you go to if you go to the Midwest. In particular, if you're in what a lot of people call flyover country, places like Nebraska, Kansas, even Indiana, Ohio, all of those places were laid out using something called the Northwest Ordinances. Mm-hmm. And that means that within every, there are certain, all of the streets are in a grid, all of the major roads are in a grid, and you've got 40-acre fields, and 4 of those compose a zone. And in the middle of those, there was actually a zone that was to be reserved for the town, which, according to the congressional bill set up in, I think it was 1789, it was established that in that area, in that reserved grid, there would be a place for a school, a post office, and a church. So you have to realize that there are little itty-bitty towns dotting the country where there is a local church that might minister to 5, 6 families in that community. So, So let me give you Shaler's grid, and we'll just talk a little bit about these as they go. Shaler says, for example, that a church of 35 to 50 is what he calls a cat church. Now, he says they're a cat church because, as Shaler says, nobody owns a cat.
I've heard this.
Yes.
I've never even attempted to own a cat. So
Yeah. He says nobody owns a cat. He says a cat a cat is willing to share his space with you, but he's not actually ever owned. It's kind of like dogs have owners, cats have staff.
Yeah.
And to some extent, churches that are under 50 are like that, especially for, a young pastor coming in, taking that church of 35 to 50 people. He has to understand that church has a mentality that says, we don't need anybody else. We are who we are.
Yeah.
So if you're living in a community where every town has a church of 50 people, most likely those churches are exceptionally content, not only in their size, they don't necessarily need to grow because they don't actually even need their pastor, but they have actually no interest in actually getting along with anybody. Why?
Right.
It's just not a necessity.
Yeah.
Right.
They're kind of self-sufficient. The pastor kind of serves at their behest.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
And
the
any
sermon is the can opener.
And any attempt, and any attempt to change that is often met with fierce resistance. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So Shaler's next level up is, he says the churches under 100, so let's say 50 to 100, he said those are collie dog churches.
Okay.
Yeah. He says everybody loves a collie. You have like a collie, you have an Australian Shepherd.
Yeah.
And she's a sweet dog. She's very caring. We love her because if you're in her family, if you're in her flock, she'll spend her entire time making sure that her flock is safe.
Yep. She'll lay between you and any door in the house.
Yeah.
And she just kind of has an eye on everybody.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. Yeah. So, collies are warm. Collies are friendly. They bark at strangers, right? We owned a Shetland for a while, and she would bark the moment any car door slammed on our street, and then she would bark at the door until the person came to the door, and the moment she got to the door, she'd run away.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. She'd done her job. She had barked at strangers.
She had alerted the neighborhood. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's kind of like the Church of 100. They're warm. Everybody loves that church.
Yeah.
Everybody's a friend in that church. Everybody's family. Everybody knows everybody else's secrets in that size church. Everybody knows what the other person's bringing to the potluck. If you're new to a church that's that size, it will take you a long time to integrate into that church, just because it's family, right? And because it takes a long time to integrate in, you may feel uncomfortable for a while, but if you'll hang in there with that size church, you'll feel very comfortable with it eventually.
Yeah.
Right? So the next size up is churches that are 100 to 200 are like a garden.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've got a garden right now. I've got tomatoes, I've got peppers, I've got some green beans going. Sometimes I'll get some peas, some squash. And one of the things that I have going with my garden is I know that Things don't get planted at the same time. My lettuce is just about ready to harvest, but I planted that when there was still snow on the ground here. So I'll take my lettuce out here soon. I can't put my tomatoes out till almost June here in Massachusetts. So, my tomatoes are a long time coming. And so with a garden, there are lots of things happening. There are different things growing at different times. There's all kinds of activity going on in my garden. There's all kinds of work and pruning, and some things are being pruned, some things are being picked, some things are being planted. So when you're in a church of less than 200 people, there is just this ongoing maintenance work of keeping that church at
Healthy.
200.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the cool thing is there's lots of growth going on. That's why it's awesome to call it a garden, because there's lots of growth going on in churches of 100 to 200. And, those churches are defying the odds, right? Because they're greater if they're more than 100.
They're larger than most
They're
of the
larger than
churches.
80% of the churches in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah. So next church up is the house. It has 200 to 300 people in it. It has lots of different rooms. Some rooms you might be in a lot. Some rooms you'll be in less. They all need dusting. They all need care. It's also quite likely in a church of 200 to 300 people that you're going to have outside vendors coming in to take care of things that you as the householder can't take care of, right? The next level up is a mansion house. That's 300 to 500 people. And one of the things about a mansion is that when you get, your brother lives in Indianapolis,
Mm-hmm.
and he'll take us into town on down a road called Meridian.
Mm-hmm.
And Meridian is just, it has just mansions on both sides of the road. You pass the governor's mansion on the way in there, and it's kind of a fun drive. And I remember one time we were driving down those houses or down through those houses, and someone that was with us said, "Man, can you imagine all the cleaning you'd have to do when you keep a house like this?"
Mm-hmm.
And somebody else that was in the car with us said, "If you own a house like that,
You don't clean. You have a staff that comes in to clean for you."
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it might have been me. I think I said that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's the thing about a mansion. If your church has 300 to 500 people, you have staff.
Yeah.
Now, all these churches, right? Everything from the garden church up,
Probably has multiple staff.
multiple staff.
Right.
Right. But I think that the issue here is that when you get to a mansion of 300 to 500 people, you have self-empowered and directed staff.
Who have a more specific role.
Right.
Right. It's because I think one of my jokes when people ask me what I do as a pastor here at Marsh, and we're in that garden size, verging on, right? Like we're in the upper 100s, low 200s, depending. And so we have a 2-pastor staff here. And when people ask me what my role here is, I joke that I'm the everything else pastor. That you handle the typical things you would think a pastor handles. You preach almost weekly. You teach regularly. You do hospital calls and counseling and study and things like that. And I handle everything from student ministry to ministry oversight to picking up the dry cleaning. Like that's just it's everything else that needs to be done. I kind of have a hand in. But when you get to a certain size that's beyond the size of Marsh Corner, you have to start getting very specific about what your staff does. Like this is the junior high pastor, and this is the senior high pastor, and this is the worship pastor, and let me introduce you to our community life or small group pastor or leader or elder. And so there's more specificity at that point in the mansion phase, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So the next level up is the rancher. And his church has between 500 and 700 people in it.
Okay.
And here's the key idea. I mean, we have no handle on ranches up here in New England. I mean, we have farms, but and just perspective, right? So we have lived on a farm of 600 acres, and that was pretty crazy. But that's nothing like the ranches of the West, where you may have 600 acres in a field.
Sure. I mean, there are ranches in Texas that are larger than Rhode Island, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Why do they always pick on Rhode Island, by the way? What is it about
I
that?
don't even know why it's a state.
Yeah, there it is. So, another group of people who are now offended.
Yeah.
So here's the thing with a rancher. He does not necessarily know everything that's going on his ranch. He may not have been at the back fields for 6 months, but somebody does. Somebody knows what's going on. He can't manage all of it, but he has people who manage all of it so that he can manage all of it.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
It just requires more structure.
Right. So then we get to what I call corporate church. Okay, or big box church, right? Big box church is churches over 1,000 people.
Okay.
Now, there are very few of these.
Yeah, they get all the headlines. It seems like there's tons of them, but in relation to the rest of the church, very few.
They're really very few of these. And these guys, God bless them, they are doing amazing work, right? But in a church over 1,000 people, the pastor is not expected to know who everybody is.
Yeah, and depending on the size, the pastor even struggles to know everybody on their staff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you take a church. We were talking to a fellow one time who was a pastor in a church in Arkansas, and I think that he was hired to handle Sunday school classes of 18 to 24-year-olds. Right. So there were 175 people on the staff. I mean, that's the size of a garden.
Right.
It's a garden church. 175 people on the church staff. So there's no way you know everybody in that kind of mentality. So in that case, you're managing managers of managers.
Right. So everybody is, hopefully, if the church is doing its job, everybody is known who goes to that church by someone, and cared for by someone. But there's a lot. It just requires more structure in order to maintain the whole experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so, I mean, as you're defining all of these things, and then you start talking about like how do churches get along, I would think there's challenges at like every level of church size.
Sure.
On how a particular church would get along with another church in its community.
Sure.
I mean, the larger you get, you just get so overwhelmed pastorally. You get so overwhelmed with trying to care for your own community that the idea of adding on something else outside of your community is overwhelming, and it's just not possible, it seems.
Right. So think of it this way: churches of 450 and up, they have no need to get along with anybody else. They are self-contained. They have every possible need being met within their church. I mean, if you're going to a church of I one time saw Saddleback Community Church's bulletin, which was I think it was like 7 to 10 pages thick.
It's like a Cheesecake Factory menu.
It was, and the print was so fine. And here's the hilarious thing: like there were 3 pages of weekday morning breakfast men's Bible studies.
Wow.
So at any one time, let's say, Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock, there were 10 different men's prayer breakfasts going on Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock, which is just absolutely amazing, right? And if you're from one of those collie dog churches right now,
you bark at that?
Okay, yeah, you bark big time at that because you're saying, well, that's not a church. That's way too big for me, right?
Yeah.
And
how could I go there? I wouldn't know everybody. Yeah.
Right.
Hear that a lot. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. So those churches, they're self-contained, right? And that's part of the benefit of those mega churches is that they're self-contained. You get down to the churches that are like 50. As we said, they're like cats. They really don't see much of a need for them to do more than what they're already doing. More than likely, if it's 50 people, that's like, 5 or 6 families. They probably are already going out to dinner after church together. They're probably doing actually they're probably all going to somebody's house together after church. There's already a camaraderie. Their fellowship needs, their spiritual needs, they're all being fulfilled. So really, what we're talking about is those churches that we said were collie dogs, and those churches that were gardens.
Yeah.
Maybe even some of the house-sized churches under 200. So we're talking about churches between 100 and 200 who have this need of, can't we just get along?
Sure. Right. Because then at that point, your church can't fulfill all the needs it can identify. Right. Like, in a church of our size, we can look out and say, well, I have like these 2 or 3 needs, and I just don't have the people for those needs. I don't have the financial resources for those needs. And I see them. I would love to figure out how to fix them. And we pray over things like that. And we look at them like, well, at some point, hopefully God provides an answer to this need. But we don't have an answer to it now because we can't fix it because we're not big enough. We can't hire somebody for that. We can't afford that. We don't have a leader within our church who has the gift set to make that need fixed. It just exists.
Right.
And so in that space, it starts to say, well, then why can't we connect with a sister church that can fix this need?
Right. And that's a great idea. It's kind of like turning your house-sized church into, for lack of a better term, an HOA.
Yikes.
Yeah. That's exactly it. Yikes, right? I mean, everybody out there loves your HOA, right?
Yeah, so they're always so encouraging and helpful.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's the thing, is that you get into an HOA, and then, like, if you're self-managing, who's doing the management of that? Because probably if your pastor is the pastor of a church of 100 to 200 people, or 100 to 300 people, he's probably got his hands full.
Yeah.
Right. It's hard to then juggle all of the balls of all of the local pastors as well, and all of those congregations. And, we're still, most of us in the United States, we're still autonomous local churches. So why should anybody poke their nose into what we're doing? Right.
So we were talking before we went live this morning on some places where we've actually seen some of this connection done well. I think of one helpful thing where when we served together in New Jersey in separate churches, we had a monthly meeting with other pastors where we would kind of get together and encourage each other and pray for one another, and we had these relationships with these other pastors.
Right.
And which created some friendships, which then created like some avenues for resource sharing and partnership.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's like a nice entry point, I think, for some of the churches that are in that zone of like, how do we connect with other people? Like, free your pastor the space to go and connect with other pastors for encouragement and growth, and to just find some opportunity to get outside of the building. I know, like, Marsh Corner is awesome at this. Some other churches aren't as good at this, but like sometimes you just need to let your pastor have some hours outside of the building and outside of his study.
Yeah.
And your church will benefit from that.
Right.
And finding some fellowship with other ministers in the area.
Well, especially since your pastor's a gatekeeper, right?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, he's the guy who you're trusting in to keep bad stuff out. It's his shepherding duty to keep bad stuff out. So if he knows that there are other flocks nearby that are running to the same field, a good thing about a good shepherd, right? He knows his sheep, and his sheep know him, and they follow him. And I think that it's possible for shepherds to share a fold, if you will.
Yeah.
And because they have confidence in their sheep, and their sheep have confidence in their shepherd.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was just trying to think of like how that could work in practical terms. Like, do you have other examples of that? Like of
Yeah, so I had so there's two places for this. I think we're going to talk about the one of them in just a minute, and that's perhaps an avenue for parachurch organizations, which I know, okay, another group of people just turned us off, but
Right.
follow us, stick,
we'll get
stay in
around to
there,
that.
give us 4 stars on whatever.
5. We don't want 4. We want 5.
5,
Yeah.
we went 5, right? Yeah. So interesting enough, I was pastoring a church in Western New York. It was a pretty barren spot. It's kind of the area that I was telling you about, where every town had a church of 50.
Yeah.
Well, all of those churches out there were all Baptist churches. We were all fundamentalist Baptists. We were
Known for their separation.
known for our separation. Exactly. It's like we didn't hang around with anybody that wasn't part of our group. But what all of those churches realized was that there was economies of scale that could be used if we, as churches of 50 to 100, would just figure out how to get together and do it. So on a monthly basis out there was actually an evening where pastors and wives, an important part of pastoral ministry, where pastors and wives would gather together for just a covered dish supper, otherwise known as a potluck,
Classic.
which, classic, right? So they would get together, they would enjoy one another's company. One of the pastors would share a devotional, we would pray, here's the deal, we were fellowshipping, and it was great, and it made sure that our churches knew that we could fellowship together. Then a second event was with youth ministry, because all of these little churches, if you have a church of 75 people, you're not spending the money on a full-time youth pastor. So that meant that youth ministry was a struggle for all of those churches, and there were definitely teenagers. And I had a conversation with one of our teens the other day about the problem with growing up with the same 5 or 6 kids in your Sunday school class is that they are the same 5 or 6 kids, and there's absolutely no way you're going to date those 5 or 6 kids, because they're like, it's like dating your sister,
Yeah.
And so that's a problem. But here's one of the things that they did was they had a monthly event for the teens. It may have been like a social type event, like a hayride type night, or it may have just been a gathering together of all of those teens to sing and bring in a speaker that those kids would benefit from. And they benefited not only from the spiritual development, but they benefited from the fact that they were in a room with most of the time 200 to 300 other teens from the 3-county area, and saying, I'm not alone in my spiritual life.
Yeah.
Which I think is a huge issue for a lot of teens growing up in Christian churches, even churches of 200, 300,
Yeah, because if your student ministry has 20 kids in it, especially if you're in an area like ours, where we're kind of a regional church, so our students attend any one of a dozen different schools. And so if you divide 20 kids out over 12 schools, and you start to look at siblings, you might think that you're the only kid in your entire public school who loves Jesus. And so that starts to feel lonely. And one of the things that I think that's helped us, we hinted at the parachurch thing. And one of the things that's helped in our region is a parachurch organization that started as just a Christian camp that is developing into something more. It's an organization called Berea, and they have a camp here in New Hampshire, and they just purchased another one over in Maine a couple of years ago. And it's a great organization that really tries to not just have a summer camp and a winter camp experience, but also tries to pour into student ministries and churches in New England. They have a heart for New England. And one of the things that I've noticed that doing is because they do their camps so well, that kids identify with that experience and love that experience, and they will buy the merchandise and they will wear the t-shirts and the hats. And I will be out and about in our mall and I will see a teenager wearing a hat, like a beanie with that Berea B on the front of it. And I'll be like, oh, that's really cool. That kid has been aware of Jesus, and that kid may love Jesus. And just seeing that out there in the public, out in public, that's an encouragement to me, right? And so it's a good thing, like, to have some of these organizations out there helping churches that may be different, but they can trust this organization, and then they can send people to that and be resourced by that organization, and it helps the church as a whole.
Right.
And that's a really powerful thing. I think another thing, in my experience, we had a smaller parachurch organization, and parachurches are tough. You talk about pastors as gatekeepers, and one of the things I think, one of the things you may not know about us as pastors is that every day we field a half dozen phone calls from somebody wanting to use our church or our congregation for their pet project. And, will you join us for this rally, or will you use this program, or will you share this resource with your congregation? And our job is to sift that out. And 99% of it is junk. And we're trying to we spend a lot of time. We have here at Marsh Corner, we have amazing administrative assistants who just have a nose for that. And so a lot of it gets filtered before it gets to us. But then we have a second filtration process, kind of like McDonald's Coke. It tastes better because it's been filtered a few times. And that's kind of what we're hoping to do here too, right? So, but part of that is there are parachurch organizations out there that are just looking to keep their doors open by using your people to fund their program. And, we just, as pastors, kind of look at a lot of that and be like, that's not helpful.
Right.
And so there was an organization where we were in New Jersey that grew out of a ministry that helped addicts recover.
Yes.
They had camp programs, and they just continued to grow and meet different needs in the area. It's called America's Keswick.
Right.
And if you have people in your congregation who have substance abuse issues, men in your congregation have substance abuse backgrounds, you need to contact Keswick. They're one of the best in the world at what they do.
Yes, they are. Shout out to Bill Welty down there.
Yeah. So one of the things that they did a number of years ago while I was still serving there, now it's been several years, but one of the things that they did brilliantly, I loved this, and it was one of the first times that a parachurch organization did this in my experience, is they came to us as a group of student ministry pastors and said, how can we partner with you that will, in a way that enhances what you do as a church? So rather than coming to us with, this is what we're doing now, please send your children to us, they said, how can we resource you well? And out of that came a youth night that we did once a month called Beyond. And we rotated the responsibility of providing music, and then we also rotated the responsibility of teaching. And so as student ministry pastors, we all rotated those things. And Beyond grew from I think the first night we might have had 50, 60 kids at it to something with hundreds of students, because it developed this reputation of trying to resource the church and help it. And it became it still is this movement of local churches that can get along, that have similar but not identical beliefs and values, but can partner together in a way that's a beautiful expression of the kingdom of God. And I think things like this are really helpful. So if you have this heart, we talk about how do churches get along. If this is a heart thing for you, you're spending time in Scripture, you're spending time with the Lord, and you are being challenged in that time to find unity among churches. Maybe take some notes from some of these things. Know that there are people who are coming to your pastor on a daily basis with bad motivation. And your pastor, their knee-jerk reaction is to say no.
No.
Always. Is to throw your mailer in the trash, to reject your Facebook message, to not return your phone call, and to make sure that their admin screens you before you ever get to their office, because most of the stuff we get is junk. So that the pastor is a gatekeeper, and he is trying his very best to care for his congregation the best he can. So know that as step one, and bring that information. Say, well, what is my heart actually for, and how do we as churches resource one another and care for one another in a way that's meaningful for each of the churches that are coming. Am I doing this to take something from these churches, or are we doing this to give something to the kingdom? And then from there, finding ways to encourage and resource these ministries and these pastors and then these churches. And out of that, I think you can find some wonderful unity that still allows churches to have their unique character and their unique flavor that they've developed as a body, but also resources them in a way that makes them better at what they do than they would have been without it.
Right. And of course, we have a situation as well here with wandering sheep, right? I mean, we have, and this has soured pastors on community gatherings of churches, because I think every church has had an experience, and every pastor has had an experience where, people have left our church and they've gone to the church that's a mile up the road that is just about like us, and it creates a cynicism, if you will, amongst pastors along the lines of, well, if we gather together, then my church is going to find out about their church, and maybe my people will just leave.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that pastors have to deal with.
Yeah, it's a level of insecurity that we kind of all have.
Yeah. And it's funny because my experience with that was the closer pastors get, step one obviously is that step of getting together on a regular basis to pray, maybe just to eat lunch together,
play around at golf, something.
Yeah. I call it church life light. I think that most pastors don't. I've been in pastors groups where they gathered, they prayed, somebody preached, and then we went home. And I have to tell you, as a pastor, I struggled with those things. It's maybe I'm showing my worldly side, but it wasn't healing in any way, and it wasn't encouraging in any way. I think the greatest need that pastors have is for fellowship, and not for education or teaching. They've already got the education and teaching, we would hope. Right. I think that the goal there is fellowship. So I found that it's very comforting when pastors get together. They eat, which is, of course, Christian armor. And then they pray together, but they also talk. And the more they talk with one another, the more they become comfortable with each other and each other's churches. And at that point, I've had experience with this where, somebody from my church has gone to another church, or somebody from another church is now visiting my church. And Monday morning, I'm calling up my fellow pastor in our organization or our fellowship, and I'm just saying, hey, the Smiths were in church yesterday. Mm-hmm. What's going on with that? How do I get them back to you? Mm-hmm. And sometimes the statement is, well, what, the Smiths, I've released the Smiths. Here are their issues with me. We've dealt with them, but they're looking for a church. It would be great if you would take the Smiths in. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's just okay. So yeah, let's work with the Smiths together. Which a lot of times the Smiths don't appreciate that.
No, they'd rather do it in anonymity.
Yeah. But that's one of the things. It keeps flocks whole.
Yeah, which is the piece that the last episode we were doing this. I kind of hinted at this piece too. And one of the ways to promote unity in the church is for the members of the church to understand where they fall in all of this. That we each, as a believer in Jesus, are a piece of a local church, hopefully. And as we go there, that church is better because our spiritual gifts are there to influence it. And one of the ways that you can make your church the best possible church is to pour your energy into it. And I think all churches hurt a little bit when its members move on.
Yes.
And sometimes there are excellent reasons to move on from a church. I as a pastor, I've moved on from churches, and for I believe excellent godly reasons. God calls other places, and He does that for pastors. He does that for church members. But knowing that like that movement does impact the community is important. And one of the ways that you can really help your church be unified with other believers in your area is to be committed with to your local church, and also be communicative with the leadership of your local church, to be able to come to them and say like, hey, I noticed this other thing that looks wonderful. What do you think about that? Like, is that something that we can do? Is that something that I can help with? Is that something do you think that's something that would benefit our community, or is that just a neat thing to look at? Like, having those conversations with your church leadership, it builds all kinds of trust. And it, I think, ultimately helps the church be better. And when a pastor can be comfortable with knowing that his flock loves like one another and is committed to its local health, then it frees your pastor to be able to go and find some of those other resources elsewhere.
Right.
And so there's a lot of that. There's so much, there's complexity in this answer, right? Like, there's the stuff that we just avoid. We talked about that for a lot of episodes. But in these places of being together, you really need some trust as a group and as a church family, I think, to be able to then start expanding your walls a little bit to partner with other groups.
Right.
And the other thing in this is, we talked a few episodes back about things like the Billy Graham Crusade and these other movements, and pastors being like nervous about like partnering with some of those things because like, well, if we're partnering with this like super like incredibly different church, we're both going to the same organization, and the minister of that church is praying, what are my people going to think? Like, do you think that church is okay because they're so much different than we are? I think the other thing of this is like knowing who you are. Like, if you're now that you've listened through this podcast for a while, I'm hoping that you've been able to clarify some things that makes your local church unique from other churches. And the more clear you are on what makes your church unique and what you believe, that means that your pastor doesn't have to be as worried about associating with churches that are different, because his flock knows what makes them unique. And he doesn't necessarily have to worry about his sheep wandering over to a really bad shepherd, because his sheep can sniff that out and they know already. And they just know that, well, then this opportunity is good, but that shepherd, we'll just kind of like hang out with them for a bit for this like mutual experience, but it doesn't attract me. So like those are other pieces to that help with this whole process. We as pastors love unity, and we love the gathering of local churches, not necessarily for unison. You talk about unity, we're harmony people. If you're gonna look at the music thing, like we want to be able to maintain the things that make us unique and different. And if we can do that as churches together in the same space, it creates much nicer music than all of us singing in unison. But that's the kind of thing that we love to pursue. We want to pursue great music as the body of Christ.
Right.
And I think one of the ways that we can do that is, for pastors, if you're listening to this and you're a pastor, is to have some confidence in your people, and maybe look outside the walls of your church for, maybe for some connection with a local pastor. Give a local pastor a phone call or an email this week and be like, hey, we serve in the same area, but I don't really know you that well. My bad. Let's get lunch. Can I take you to breakfast? Can we get together just so I can know you? I mean, that's a good first step for pastors.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you're a member of a church, like encourage your pastor on that, and encourage, and find ways to continue to know who you are as a believer, so that we can expand this movement of believers who are sharing Jesus with others.
Yeah, that's the best way of doing it. And, seek out the folks that are like you and find the places where you can work together is a great idea. So, yeah, that pretty much summarizes my ideas on this.
Awesome. I'm glad I could do that for you.
Yeah. So I guess we're going to begin a new series next week when we get together.
Yeah. So I think some of you, like my wife, has been asking for several weeks now, when are we going to be done with church history?
Yeah.
And I'm kind of sad about that. I love history, but I know not all of you do. And so next time we're back together, we'll start a new track. Maybe it'll be a one-off episode. We'll see. I don't know if you have ideas that you're going to like tease just now, where we can like leave people hanging until next time we're together.
I know that one thing I'd like to talk about eventually is all of the things that I think that young pastors should know about pastoring churches.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, since you're in our study and hanging out with us, maybe you get some insight into the things that we think about. You got some of that today, even. Some of the things that your pastor is feeling that maybe you don't know about, and some of the things that your pastor does in the week that you weren't aware of. Let's go down that road a little bit. Some things that, like, if you're new to the ministry, some things that they didn't teach you in seminary that you might want to know.
Right, and obviously that also connects to you as a congregation, right? You don't have to phase this out because you're not a pastor. It's still the idea of, wow, I didn't realize that my pastor may or may not have known that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, join us next time. Thanks for tuning in. Check out our Facebook page, Inside the Pastor's Study Podcast. Give us a great rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. And then finally, the best thing that you can do with this podcast is to share it with a friend. Let them know that it might be something they'd be interested in, and let them know why. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. You've been listening to Inside the Pastor's Study Podcast, hosted by Pastors George and Jeremy Stevens. Cover art by Caitlin Gallagher, music by Sammy Kay. To find out more about us, head to marshcorner.com.